Afternoon, and thank you, Nanette, for that short and sweet intro. Looking at you, I feel more than ever before that I'm young enough to be your Lola. You're also young. Anyway, first I must thank the organizers of this series of lectures celebrating the masterful literary output of one of the almost forgotten icons among the first generation of Filipino writers in English. I must confess that as a student and later teacher of English, I had only a vague recollection of her name and thus could not associate it with the story Desire, a narrative that had, even then, struck me as a most arresting title for a narrative about a unique woman character. Unique in that she's holy, she's a holy heroine, and yet as elegant as the way her story was written. The organizers also informed me that in this year's marking of Dr. Latorena's life and words, the emphasis is on her other less-known profession, her being a teacher. I was tapped as a speaker because I too am a teacher that has more recently become a writer. In turn, I warned Dr. Urquiola that much of what I shall deliver here will have to do with my own insights as a teacher for more than 50 years, as well as my development as a writer halfway through the practice of my main line. Aside from the fact that I am humbled by this honor of being a speaker in a gathering set up in her name, for I am nowhere near Paz Latorena's stature as a writer, I, unlike her, was a reluctant writer. My written output came along much later in my professional life. It came as a natural consequence of my desire to continue teaching beyond the classroom doors. My paper, therefore, will have 3 parts. Can I have slide 2, please? Paz Latorena's Writing Milieu, a literature teacher's journey, the writer-teacher's millennial view. When Edilberto Alegre and Doreen Fernandez's twin books on the earlier Filipino writers in English were published, Ms. Latorena had already passed on for about 30 years, while the interviewees caught by the editors lived for about twice her lifetime. Those who cited her in the recollection of their milieu remembered her with genuine esteem and affection. Latorena lived and actively wrote her short stories in that much mythologized and idealized period in Philippine history, nostalgically and universally referred to as, quote, peacetime. Men wore white suits and hats, women wore balansaya on special occasions, and for ordinary socials, or in Miss Paz's case, at work, donned drop-waisted jerseys and silk dresses trimmed with lace in pastels and gay prints. She took on the dual role of teacher-writer seemingly easily, and in 16 years of active writing, she averaged 2 published works a year, based on the number of extant output that Dr. Eva Calao has so graciously shared with us. As a student writer, Paz was mentored not only by the legendary Paz Marquez Benitez, but also by the many distinguished American professors that the UP still had in its faculty roster. Barely out of her teens, she wrote prodigiously through the remainder of her undergraduate years. She was probably about your age when she started writing and publishing. And within the 4 years when she went into graduate studies, even now, she is often mentioned by critics as among Mrs. Benita's star pupils that included Loreto Parasuli and Bienvenido Santos. Her writings are described as works with quote, subtlety and delicacy and finesse of patrician timelessness. As a writer, she's, quote, adroit, exquisite, magnificent. The significance of these accolades is compounded by their sources. Jose Garcia Villa and A.E. Fiarco, to mention just two of the severest critics of the time. Curiously, the narrative themes that she focused on were not unlike what woman writers today are preoccupied with. The role of a Filipina as wife, mother, sister, or aunt. She even touched on matters that most writers of the time perhaps considered too touchy or ticklish to write about, like the non-traditional women's roles of the working career-driven wife, the disillusioned wife who had thought she married a perfect husband, but later finds him wanting, and those about women without men. These women characters were created at the time of a new social order, a milieu that was steeped in new, rather radical paradigms. The change was drastic, indeed. Imagine swinging out of the ancient convent into the dizzying world of Hollywood. Such concepts as divorce, Freudian views on sexuality, and anti-heroes have begun to emerge. Dr. Eva Calao, the best-known of La Torena scholars, bemoans the older critics' focus on her stories of the woman as martyr and woman in more traditional roles. She feels, as this reader does, that the stories with alternative themes deserve more attention and serious study. It is in these stories that La Torena's vision seemed to extend beyond her time and presaged feminist identity crisis of the last quarter of the 20th century. From Dr. Calao's research, we learned that although she was prolific just before the outbreak of the war, there is only one title recorded during the war and nothing right after. The relative sparseness of her output during the war could be attributed to the very abnormal situation. She could have written much based on the rich resources of possible fictive plots, given the tenor of the times. But there was censorship of the worst kind, we are told. A big mystery to me, second only to why she remained single, was the total absence of extant short stories in the decade before her death, especially as the end of the war seemed to have ignited a renaissance of sorts in the arts, including literature. As a teacher, she is described by her students and colleagues as, quote, effective, dynamic, dedicated. But such words as, quote again, volcanic, colorful, and volatile are also attributed to her, underscoring the passionate nature of her character as a classroom dynamo. No greater proof of her dedication as a mentor could be better gleaned than by the fact that she collapsed in the classroom while proctoring an exam. She literally, like the great patriots of old, died with her boots on, and probably with a pen or a piece of chalk in hand. Now that would be the key to the mystery of the death, of the dearth in creative writing that we note in her post-war years. She became such a dedicated teacher that she lacked the time to scheme and dream. Now, of course, that is just conjecture. Her academic background is remarkable, even by today's standards. After attaining her undergraduate education degree in 1930, she completed both her master's and doctoral degrees in 4 years. With only a bachelor's degree, she was made to teach in college as Instructor 1. Within the decade, she was made a professor in the UST Graduate School. Her own students included another roster of who's who in Philippine letters, like the already mentioned F. Johnny Jose and Teodoro Valencia, as well as the younger ones like Eugenia Apostol, and Zenaida Amador. So Paz Gatodena's life's journey began as a writer and then evolved as teacher. It is exactly the reverse of mine. Now I will now tell you about myself and my journey as a literature teacher. I initially took up the pen as a textbook writer when I was well into 20 years of teaching high school English. The first products were 2 high school textbooks, and I had since produced 2 each for the elementary and the tertiary level. Writing textbook is simply teaching in another form. Meanwhile, my teaching career had 2 phases: teaching teenagers and later teaching other teachers. My readings and lesson plans in Philippine literature as a teacher of high school English in the 80s and early 70s were full of Manuel Aguila, Jose Garcia Villa, Paz Marquez Benitez, Angela Manalang Gloria. Those were the years when English was the premier department in every school, public or private. Those were the years when the students could code from Filipino canon, number 4, please, slide. She was as fragrant as the morning when papayas were in bloom. And the foreign-based literary gems, the quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. Or the woods are lovely, dark and deep, that I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. Lately, Facebook has made it possible for me to retrieve the thread of friendship with my students of the 60s. They are now themselves senior citizens and retirees, and my star pupil of 1965 is here. He is now the Director of Communication Foundations of Asia, and I think he is taping my talk for the YouTube. Mr. If I am young enough to be your Lola, he is old enough to be your Papa. Lately, Facebook has made it possible at a Balikbayan gathering in late December. This group does not include Mr. De Leon. This is another group. This is class 69. Okay. I had dinner with some of them, and at a certain point over coffee, they started throwing remembered lines from high school literature classes. They were throwing lines at each other over coffee. Number 5 slide, please. One of them would start with a line like, I cannot love thee with a love that outcompares the boundless sea. And someone across the coffee table would complete the passage with, for that were false, and no such love and no such ocean could ever be. And suddenly one of them hollered, Mom, how come my children seem not to have read what you had made us read in our time? So I told them that it was one of the most devastating effects of the bilingual policy that began in 1975. Devastating in that not only had the students not mastered both Filipino and English, which was actually the policy's main objective, but also since English as a subject, as we know it, was demoted from being the premier subject to a service course. Thus, we had turned out literary barbarians. After 1975, instead of reading My Last Duchess or The Distance to Andromeda, high school kids had to learn discourse analysis using such materials as The Life Cycle of a Frog or How to Identify a Drug Addict. There was a time in the 70s when every reading material that came from the materials committee would be about drug addiction, and the drug addiction was actually flowing out of your ears. We had too much of them, and yet we continue to have drug addicts now. Filipino as a subject began to serve as a teenager's only link with literature. Some inspired Filipino textbook writers wrote translations of world classics, but there were not too many of them. Today, hardly is there a young person who had read excerpts from the English translation of Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, the most anthologized of which was the chapter on the bishop's candlesticks. Do you remember them, my friends? Okay. Thanks to the London West End, Broadway, and Hollywood, now they know about Jean Valjean and Javert, only because they are played by popular hunks like Hugh Jackman and Russell Crowe. And they also thankfully discovered Jane Austen, because Hollywood produced such popular movies as Clueless and Bridget Jones' Diaries, which are actually spin-offs of Emma and Pride and Prejudice, respectively. Pride and Prejudice has had at least 3 movie versions across the years. Too bad we do not have producers who would have turned dead stars for The Day the Dancers Came, even The Small Key or Desire, into lovely independent movies. The movie industry, being a blatantly profit-oriented business, would not have the passion or the guts to take risks in churning out so-called artsy and hoity-toity products based on literary canons, believing that they would be beyond the grasp of the massa. But aren't those stories about ordinary Filipino men and women? And shouldn't mass communication experts raise the bar on popular culture? There was a TV series then called Balintataw, featuring Filipino narratives written by canonized writers. And happily, the viewership did not equal the awards. It garnered through the seasons it was on. Lately, there was an attempt to produce stories for young viewers, but it fizzled out faster than the flick of an eyelash. Next, please. My recent encounters with my former students explain why I stayed in the classroom for 50 years and how I have in fact expanded the classroom walls to include halls like this. The teaching-learning experience actually did not come from one direction, that is, from teacher to students. My students actually taught me as well. They introduced me to literary cults that were in through the 60s and the 70s. They were not exactly new, but the young people were reading The Little Prince, Jonathan Livingston Seagull, The Greatest Salesman in the World, and The Prophet. Even more popular was the little red book of one Chinese revolutionary called Mao. Also, my students sang the International to me when I got curious. Being a teacher of the young can sustain the youthful in every teacher. To be youthful is the capacity to wonder and to be open to new things and new perspectives. My high school students then also began encouraging me to write for publication. Number 1, si Noel. They said it was unfair that I kept encouraging them to write when I was not writing myself. I began to think about writing, but I felt unworthy. I had been exposed to the best examples of written works from all over the world, and it seemed presumptuous to attempt to produce something that may approximate them. It took me almost 30 years to finally give in. A career change triggered that. After 18 years of dealing with teenagers, I joined the faculty of UP College of Education and steered away from teaching English and discovered a highly specialized field, and that is reading education. I was able to teach teachers how to teach reading the first hour. You know, 3 hours reading, writing, arithmetic, and reading is the first hour. In the reading department, the bilingual policy of teaching reading using science and math-based materials was almost completely ignored. The rule was, slide 7 please, teach literacy through literature. Even when teachers used content-based materials, these had to be literary. So we used the works of Friedman Fadiman, Carl Sagan, Bertrand Russell, Ayn Rand, and Fulton Sheen. They were disciples of science and philosophy, and they all wrote beautifully. Then, part of the curriculum for reading majors was children's literature. I discovered the magic, I'm going to name drop again, Maurice Sendak, Kathleen Peterson, Barbara Cooney, Erin Carr, and Leo Leone. I even got acquainted with Jose Arveco, a Filipino lawyer who left the Philippines to pursue his dream. And his dream was to illustrate children's books. And that he did since 1970 till the time of his death last August on his 80th birthday. He illustrated the works of some of the most beloved writers for children from North America. He also illustrated his own stories about 2 playful carabaos, a few crocodiles, and 1 and the swans, featuring the dark creatures of Philippine mythology, using our mountains, rivers, and plains, and barrios as backdrops. I exposed the teachers to be and full-fledged teachers in the master's and doctoral levels to the richness of literature for children. I started to teach literature for young people when it was a green field blossoming under the green thumbs of Emilio Almario and Rene Villanueva, part of the original stable of writers that made Aklat Madarna a household word. The preschool boom that started in the 90s showed publishers, teachers, parents, and writers that they have a tremendous army of clients in young readers. Thus, today, all major publishing companies have a line of children's titles. Major bookstores now feature carpeted alcoves for children's books around which children may browse freely in cozy corners. A few of my students have ventured into writing, and they have been published, even winning book awards along the way. Again, they have also challenged me to write, and again, I was reluctant at first, realizing that only the best writers should write books for the young. It takes a special kind of talent to seduce young readers to hold a book with 30 to 32 illustrated pages, long enough to actually read the words beneath the pictures. By then, I had produced some textbooks, but to write creatively was another ballgame. In 1983, the UP Writers Workshop, now known as the Likaan, offered summer training for writers aspiring to write for children. I thought I would join it to acquire some technical know-how. I have, of course, read so much on the matter, having taught kiddingly, but there's nothing like an actual hands-on experience, like a writer's workshop. Likaan had once sponsored 2 more on children's lit. Applicants are asked to submit 5 titles, and if accepted, one of them is critiqued by the mentors as well as by the rest of the participants. The author's identity is revealed only after the session. The UP workshops are known to be tough and humbling. Inferior manuscripts are consigned to hell and the trash can, and the author's egos reduced to proverbial pulp. The mentors in English during the critiquing of my story included Ricardo de Metilio, Silvino Epistola, and Hemino Abad. Those were the ones who reacted to my paper. They read my story Lazy Bum, and strangely the mentors were kinder to me. The participants thought my theme, unconditional love, was not realistic. However, the mentors liked it that one even declared, "If you change just a single word, I will shoot you." That experience encouraged me naturally, and when Virgilio Almario invited some UNESCO-sponsored resource persons and trainers to hold a workshop on writing for adolescents, I also joined it. The requirement was to write a book for adolescents consisting of 10 chapters. Aside from the outline, we were required to submit a complete chapter. I never had the chance to complete it on time, but polished it further and submitted it as a self-contained story for Palanca, and it won. The title is The Gem, a historical narrative set in 19th century Manila. I have yet to finish it as a novel, but it has been anthologized by Tahanan Bookmark along with 9 other Palanca winners in the same category in a collection entitled The Golden Loom. So you see, as a writer, I am not as well trained as Paz Laturena, but conditions in our time are such that in less than 10 years, I have published 16 picture books with about half a dozen more in the pipeline. I have been helped by such artists as Beth Parrocha and her husband Ferdinand Doctolero, Ruden de Jesus, Marcy Danis-Lee, and Neto Diaz Papa. Where do I get my stories? Mostly from childhood memories, my day-to-day encounters with nephews and nieces and their children. A few based on news reports, like dolphins that rescued 2 drowning children, a whale that fell in love with a ferry boat, a parrot that auditioned for a stage play, or the imagined guardian angel of a little girl named Sarah, who was greeted by the Pope at an audience. Thus has my writing career taken off. Now, what do writers in the millennial milieu have to contend with? If there is one thing good that can be said of the new K-12 curriculum, it is that it is literature-based. Hallelujah. Actually, the pendulum has started swinging since the late 80s. It has been swinging back to literature, and the momentum started not in the United States, but in New Zealand and Australia. However, the students will not have much time with literature. It is merely one of the 9 domains to be taken up in all English courses. Aside from the familiar, like vocabulary, oral language, grammar, vocabulary, there are new thingamajigs like visual literacy, fluency, and alternative assessment tools. Well, to get literature back even for just 1/9 of the time is better than nothing. The new curriculum also offers plenty of opportunities for teachers interested in writing instructional materials that could complement the features that utilizes the mother tongue as medium of instruction. There is now a great demand for stories in the different major Filipino languages. The DepEd suggests that the lore of the different regions be featured. For instance, the Bicol region may yield both fiction and non-fiction materials about the Mayon volcano, the pili nuts, the hot spicy food, and the coconut-based fancy dishes that the place is famous for, all written in the most comprehensible of Bicolano language varieties. As we all know, in the Bicol Peninsula alone, there are scores of variations of Bicol itself, but the most acceptable is that from Albay and Naga. Okay. In Region 7, Bohol in particular, there could be stories in Visaya about the Tarsier, the Chocolate Hills, as well as the famous blood compact between Sikatuna and Legazpi. In Latorena's time, the teachers and textbook writers only had to worry about one language, English. Later, during the Commonwealth and Quezon's presidency, Tagalog was in greater demand as we were being groomed for independence. For fictionists today, there is a dearth of books for adolescents. Young adults aged 18 to 24 are referred to as the millennials. If you're between 18 and 24, some would even extend it to 34, you would be referred to as millennials. They were born immediately before, during, and after the turn of the century. They are known to be visual learners. Kayo raw, mga visual learners. Without patience for following directions. They would rather discover for themselves how a thing works. They enjoy interactive activities and work better in groups or teams. Totoo ba yun? They are tech-savvy, look down on nerds and dorks, numbering among them their own teachers. Ayun. Slide 8, please. After my retirement, Anvil's Publishing's Lina Diaz lamented the fact that the current crop of Filipino novelists do not enjoy a wider and more enthusiastic readership than they deserve. She sent me piles of novels and novelettes and suggested that I create a book that would guide teenage readers and their teachers toward an appreciation of them. I chose 7 of the many titles, worked on them, featuring lesson plans for each and a roster of activities that could enliven and enrich could enliven lesson plans. Nawala ko. Featuring restorative activities that would enliven and enrich classroom encounters with the novels. The authors are a happy mixture of the canonized and the most talented of the younger group of fictionists. The title of the guidebook is Teaching Filipino Novels, and the canonized authors and titles are Nicotine, Candida's Apocalypse, which is a novelette, Edith Tiempo, another novelette, The Builder, Merlinda Bobis, she's one of the most talented of our younger fictionists. She's also a poet. Her book, Banana Heart Summer, you should not miss. Charleston Ong, Banyaga, A Song of War. Robin Lim, remember 2 years ago she was CNN Hero of the Year, the second Filipino-born CNN hero. She is a midwife working in Indonesia. And the title of her work is Butterfly People. Butterfly people are Asians. We who live in this great continent. Jose Belisae Jr., Killing Time in a Warm Place, and Victor Ordonez with Hearts Aflame are those of the current generation of keyboard pounders. As teachers, it's a gift to be able to write. It is a gift as well as an edifying grace. That way, we reach a greater number of people to help them live meaningful lives. A writer is a philosopher who reflects on life and shares what he or she has discovered about it. It may be an old insight, but because it is a product of self-discovery, the writer is restless until she is able to share his or her thought. There is in him or her what Plato calls a divine discontent that has to find an outlet, and when expressed, must be in words well wrought. How do we write? We cannot write unless we read aloud. Reading exposes us to the most authentic and excellent ways with words. A painter uses oil or watercolor in delivering his output. A sculptor uses clay, marble, or ice, or paper mache as media, again to share a glimpse of beauty that his mind's eye has perceived. The cliche goes that it's best to write what you know. A young Filipino writer, Candy Gurley, based in London, wants to add another morsel to that food for thought. Yes, write what you know, but better if you write what you are. What are you? Looking at you at this moment, I see that though some of you may be from generations X, Y, or Z, still, most of you are millennials. You are yourselves the new breed being nurtured by the new century. Pastor Lorena and my own contemporaries were formed and bred by our own respective culture of context and the struggles confronting us as well as the triumphs. Because Dr. Latavena wrote what she was. Her works were authentic and dealt with universal truths on personal identity, values, and ideals. Thus, they remained relevant and readable. Her themes and the characters that gave life to them, we still meet from day to day. Therefore, they are recognizable, and we still identify with them and understand their uniqueness and Filipino-ness. They are what they are, real and genuine. What does it mean to be real? My favorite book for children has the answer. It is Marjorie Williams' Velveteen Rabbit. To be real is not how you are made. It is a thing that happens to you. It does not happen all at once. It takes time. But once you are real, you do not become unreal again. It lasts for always. Summing up, for the teacher who wants to be a writer, I have these. Next, please. All right. Something for you to sleep on tonight. Read a lot. Write all the time. Read again. Learn from your students in order to be attuned to the tenor of their lives. And then, write what you are. An early writer like Severino Reyes wrote his 400 Lola Bashan tales in longhand. Did you know? He wrote 400 stories for children in longhand. And they are preserved. You can have a look at them at the UP archives. It is kept there. Past Latorena's generation had begun to use the typewriter, but they never dreamed of iPads and e-books. In fact, 5 to 10 years ago, they were still unknown to us. We went through the use of electric typewriters and the DOS floppy disks that were still, and we were still teetering in cyberspace. Issues of national identity, feminist causes, global warming, and the 50 Shades of Grey now preoccupy your philosophizing selves. Be real like the Velveteen Rabbit. Know what you are, then write to please yourselves and your students' generation. Earlier I said to be able to write is a gift, a grace. Well, indulge and revel in your own season of grace. Thank you.